Well, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here to help the department celebrate its 50th anniversary. It's a coincidence. My parents celebrated their 50th anniversary this year, so 1965. I owe a lot to that year. It was an auspicious year for me. In many ways, I would not be here if not for 1965. In fact, thinking a little bit more about that coincidence and about what I was asked to speak about, MIT's distinctive approach to political science, it occurred to me I owe as much to this place for being my intellectual progenitor as I do to my parents for being my biological progenitors. And in some ways, no offense to my parents, who I love very much, I'm even prouder to trace my roots here to MIT. Parents, as I'm learning, because I have my own children now, we don't really get to pick who our children are, who they even turn out to be. We don't get to review their writing samples or GRE scores before we welcome them into the family. But our intellectual parents, those who reviewed my application to MIT, they had the option to say thanks, but no thanks. And so this is just to say I'm really grateful that you guys adopted me as your intellectual child back in 1993. I could go on for a long time here about all the ways that being at MIT shaped the way I think about political science, but I was told to keep it short. And although I didn't learn this here at MIT, I do tend to follow the rules. And so I'll try to just talk about 3 key lessons. I see we're going down from whatever it was, 6 to 4 to now I'm down to 3. And I used to have more, but I cut some out. And all these 3 have to do with the way we think about questions, the questions that we do our research on here at MIT. So let me start with the first one. Probably the most important thing that I learned about doing research in political science is to start with the question. Rather than some other way. Now, to those of you, the few in the audience who are not professional political scientists, you're probably wondering, what other way is there to start doing your research if it's not with the question that you want to ask? But the truth is, and although a lot of colleagues in other institutions wouldn't admit this, that's not how it happens in many cases. Actually, many people start instead with a data set that's already been gathered or with a research methodology that they've already mastered, and they ask themselves, what questions can I answer with this data? Or what questions can I answer by redeploying this methodology again? And there are some advantages, I think, to doing research that way. It builds on a scholar's existing strengths and the resources that they've already built up. But needless to say, that way of thinking about your research is not a recipe for producing the kind of research that's going to really shake up the field and have a lasting impact. Instead, I think it tends to produce a kind of derivative, narrow research agenda of the kind I'm glad we don't see much of coming out of MIT. That segues conveniently to the second lesson I learned at MIT about how to approach political science, and that is to not be afraid of asking big questions. I still remember sitting in Steve Van Ivre's office when I told him that I was going to write my dissertation about, wait for it, the causes of genocide, full stop. Not in one part of the world, not in one specific time. And I was waiting for the look on his face in which he was going to tell me that this was too broad or overly ambitious. He told me a lot of things, don't get me wrong. He had a lot of critiques and criticisms, as he always does, but never did he say it was too broad or overly ambitious. And so that was quite freeing for me. And in fact, I recently came across a blog post from Steve in which he had a great quote, which I've already used with my own students. And the quote goes, "A good answer to a trivial question is still trivial." So Steve hasn't changed his tune on that one, and I'm glad. And again, just looking back at the research that's been described here today, I won't repeat it. You can see just how marvelous it is when people don't throw out the big questions before they even get started. And I think that happens all too often at other places, and I'm so glad it doesn't happen here. Third lesson I learned, and the last one I'll talk about how to approach political science. Research also has to do with the kinds of questions we ask, but this is not about asking big ones or starting with the questions. It's to say, and this has come up a lot today, we should do questions that have clear and direct relevance to things we care about in the real world. Again, many of you will have heard Steve Van Ivre rail against the cult of the irrelevant in political science. Back in my day, I don't think Steve had developed that particular epithet yet for some of our colleagues, but instead he had something that we called the cocktail party test. And the cocktail party test says if you want to know whether you've found a worthwhile research question to do your work on, imagine that you're at a cocktail party speaking with somebody who doesn't have a PhD in political science, and that you've got just 2 minutes to explain the topic that you've chosen. Will, after that 2 minutes, the person understand why you've chosen to devote years of your life to this question, or will they think you're a little bit batty? And if the answer is that they think you're a little bit batty, you might want to go back and reevaluate the question that you've chosen. You've failed the test, and you want to think about whether what you're going to work on is really relevant to the world. A lot of my friends, political scientists, don't like the idea of a cocktail party test, either because it sounds like we're pandering to the ignorant masses, or more substantively, I think, they think that there's some kind of inevitable trade-off between the rigor and relevance that are the subtitle for this symposium today, that you kind of can't have one and the other, and that when you're forced to make that trade-off, a good social scientist should always choose rigor over relevance. But that's not the way we think about it here at MIT, never was. But that's not, again, because we were told that we should just always prefer relevance over rigor. Instead, we reject the idea that these two things are inevitably at loggerheads, that there's a trade-off between them. And we think you can have both. Sometimes, of course, there really will be highly relevant questions that matter for policy, for which the existing data don't permit us to craft answers that we would have the kind of confidence in that we might like to have. If we want to know whether, say, some countries like Iran that get nuclear weapons will become more bellicose once they get them, well, we obviously can't do a randomized control experiment there. We can't take 20 countries at random and give 10 of them nuclear weapons and the other 10 not nuclear weapons and then wait 50 years to see whether there's a nuclear war, right? That's not an option for us. But the thing that was drilled into me at MIT about questions like this, dilemmas like this, is that whatever we're thinking about these questions, we know policymakers are making deeply consequential decisions based on what are essentially guesses to those very same questions that we are struggling with. And they're going to make those guesses whether or not we as political scientists deign to help them do it or not. And if that's correct, then really the question we have to answer before we start on a research project is not whether our methods are rigorous or not in some absolute sense. It's whether our methods are better and can give us more confidence in our answers than the methods that are being used already by the people who are going to make these decisions that matter so much to the real world. And that's why, to me, it's in these moments when I hear on all these panels about the work that my advisors and former classmates are doing to actually shape contemporary debates about things that we really do care about the things that would easily pass the cocktail party test, that I'm proudest to say I went to MIT. Like a lot of young scholars, I chose this field, political science, because I cared about the real world and I wanted to make a difference. Maybe I was a little bit naive. But to whatever extent I've succeeded at that so far in my work, or hope that I might succeed in that in the future, I know I owe a great deal, a big debt to MIT for teaching me to think about things in the best possible way. So that's it.